My name is Ali, I'm a doctor and YouTuber.
I'm Tamor, I'm a data scientist and writer.
And you're listening to Not Overthinking,
the weekly podcast where we think about happiness, creativity and the human condition.
Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. In this episode, we're going to be playing the audio from a podcast that Tamor and I did a couple of weeks ago with these two wonderful chaps called Jack and Freddie, who run a podcast called Episode.party. And the idea behind the Episode.party podcast is that guests share their own podcast recommendations, and then we all kind of discuss the particular episodes that we recommended. So in this episode, we discuss 4 different podcasts. Firstly, we discuss the Casual Birder podcast, in which we talk about the Corvid Family. Then we talk about one of my recommendations, which is the IndieHackers podcast, specifically episode number 34. Then we talk about the Should This Exist podcast, specifically an episode about the return of the Supersonic jet. And finally, we talk about one of Tame's recommendations, which is the Rhino Hunter episode of Radiolab. So yeah, Episode Party is a fantastic podcast. It was great that Jack and Freddie had us on, and we'll link obviously to their podcast in the show notes that you should definitely check out if you want some new podcast recommendations. But yeah, without further ado, here is the discussion between me, Tamor, Jack and Freddie on Episode Party podcast, episode number 57. I hope you enjoy it.
Hello and welcome to Episode Party, a podcast where we talk about our favourite podcasts. I'm Freddie Harrison.
I'm Jack Tutor.
And tonight we are joined by Ali and Tamor from the excellent Not Overthinking podcast. Hi guys.
Hey, how's it going?
Going
we said the same thing.
Wow.
That's really creepy.
Yeah, that's good co-hosting skills for you if you can say the exact same thing without realising. I think that's how that works. We have a whole bunch of podcasts to get through, 4 to chew through tonight, and to start us off is Jack. Jack, tell us a little bit about your podcast.
Sure. So mine is called The Casual Birder. It's a podcast for people interested in wild birds, presented by Susie Buttress, who is a self-proclaimed bird fanatic, and also the administrator of Max Fun London, an unofficial community for the fans of Maximum Fun podcasts, which is something I didn't even know existed, but that's cool. So my relationship with this podcast started because I read a book called The Peregrine, which is all about a peregrine falcon. And in fact, I was listening to an episode of Not Overthinking today about reading and books. And Ali and Tamor, you guys talked about books that changed your lives. And as soon as I heard that, I thought of this book. I read it earlier this year. Wow. Yeah, big time. Like, it's just basically someone following a peregrine falcon around for 10 years and writing about their experiences of seeing it and writing about it in the most beautifully prosaic way, which made me realise, I think, how much there was for me to garner from just watching birds. Like, it's such a wonderful experience. I've since become a member of the RSPB, started visiting all the local nature reserves. I've just basically got obsessed. And I found the Casual Birder podcast because I think one of the things that I do, and I'm sure this is common amongst probably all of us, is that if I find a new interest that's really getting me quite jazzed, I see if there's a podcast that can sort of support that habit. And the Casual Birder is definitely one of these podcasts. It features interviews with prominent people in the bird world, so people in the RSPB, the BTO, British Trust of Ornithology, and the episodes go from fact files on different birds, different types of birds. So the episode that I picked for everyone to listen to was on the Corvid family of birds, so that includes crows, ravens, magpies, jackdaws and jays, and it combines facts with more prosaic and anecdotal stuff as well. So Susie relays stories of birds in her own back garden. She tells this story of being stopped in her path by a raven and felt like she needed to turn back, and largely because of all of the mythology around ravens. I mean, you would as well, Freds, I think. And I just love it. I think what I really love about it is that there's a real quaint simplicity about it. There's a lovely sense of community. So listeners write in and talk about the birds they've seen in their back garden. It's got this quaintness to it, this like pure unadulterated enjoyment to it, which is just like people loving the shit out of seeing birds. And I think it's just something that, sad though it is, my wife and I just spend a lot of our mornings at the moment just sending pictures of the birds we've seen as we've been going outside. This has really been an epiphanic experience for me, getting into birds. I just think it's super accessible. I think the love of Susie just comes right through. I could go on, but I'm not going to. Freddie, tell me about what you thought of the Casual Birder podcast.
I love this.
Good.
I can't say I've got into birds in a big way like you have yet. I do have really fond memories of standing in my great aunt's kitchen and looking out into her garden. She pointing out birds to me, and she had a book on the side. She had one of those like stands you put your recipe books on, except on her stand she had a book which was just pictures of birds and what they were called underneath.
You sure she wasn't cooking some exotic stuff?
No. I mean, I don't know what exotic birds we get in the Midlands, but anyway, I do think it's one of those kind of like joyful hobbies, and it was actually like, considering I'm not into it in any way at the moment. I know you've persuaded me to go along to a bird watching spot in Dorset, but I really, really enjoyed the podcast. I think Susie's just like super charming and just really has a really lovely voice to listen to, and I just felt like the whole episode, because it was this kind of monologue about her experiences and she's kind of educating a little bit about the Corvid family, but also just talking about the birds she's seen and where she's seen them. The whole thing just felt like a kind of letter that I might get from my great auntie about the birds that she's seen in her garden. And there's something really nice about that. Like, I think that, we've got tonight like 4 very different podcasts with like very different setups and very different kind of styles, and I think there's a real place for a podcast like this where you've got someone just talking to you about something that they really love, and chances are they're talking to a lot of people who really love that thing too. And I think that was really, really charming and really, really lovely. I think her delivery's flawless. She's clearly like well scripted the episode and obviously knows her stuff, which you'd kind of hope. And I like listening to it. I think I'd have to be into birds to really want to get into it properly as a podcast. I'm not going to go away and listen to a lot more until I've done a bit of appreciating of bird watching myself. I mean, I could probably join in with my cat where we're sitting in the conservatory working during the day and the cat's kind of staring at all the birds. I could probably join in there. But I think it is a great podcast, and if I start getting into bird watching, I could see myself really getting into this podcast too. So thumbs up, I'd say.
Well, hit me up if you get into birds, Freddie. I'm only down the road, so we can go bird watching together, can't we?
Oh, that's very kind.
It's on record now. Tamor, what do you think of this one?
So I think this one, I totally get what you guys are saying. I think Jack, when you describe it as having this sort of quaint simplicity, I think that sums it up really well. I thought it was super charming. I quite like animals, but I've never really been a bird person. I never really got the whole birds thing. And I remember back in the day, when Bill Oddie used to be on TV with his like spring watch and autumn watch and stuff.
Yes.
That's really the closest I've gotten to getting into birds. And I still didn't manage it.
Getting into birds. Sending photos of birds to your wife.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I have no wife to send photos of birds to, so maybe that's the problem. I think I kind of see it as like almost having like a nature documentary in the background on the TV while you're doing other stuff,
right.
Or a bit like having sort of mood lighting in the room. It was just like really charming and pleasant to listen to. I think like Susie's voice was really nice. It kind of came across as a well-produced sort of Radio 4 show or something.
Yes.
So I think aesthetically it was very, very nice, but content-wise, I don't think I recalled any information from the whole podcast. Content-wise, I think the topic is just not my thing yet. Maybe I need to read the Peregrine.
Oh, big time. Yeah. Come back to me when you read the Peregrine.
Change your life on it.
Yeah. As long as you're ready, then the Peregrine is waiting. Ali, what do you reckon?
So I fully agree with all of what you guys said about how quaint and charming this whole thing was. I actually took away some interesting points here from the content side, because unbeknownst to a lot of people, I studied psychology when I was at university, because within our 6 years of medical school, we can do 1 year where you pretty much do whatever subject you want. And I picked psychology for mine. And one of my favorite modules within that was comparative cognition, which is all about the thinking of animals. And so corvids actually feature heavily in psychology, in the psychology scientific studies about how animals think. And when this podcast was talking about how corvids are known to use tools and to kind of the Aesop's fable, whereby the raven puts stones in a thing to get the water out of it, all of this stuff started bringing back memories of like, oh my god, this is actually a real thing. And corvids do have this amazing power to use tools and fashion all these instruments and stuff. So I found it really interesting from that point of view. But there was another part of it whereby it kind of made me think about how once you know a little bit about a topic, it kind of unlocks a whole new realm of the human experience about that topic. Like, before I got into web design, I didn't really appreciate kind of nice looking websites. Before I got into like classical music and music theory, I didn't really appreciate, how pro good musicians were. And so kind of with the bird thing, I get the feeling that if we just kind of take a few steps in that direction to become a little bit educated about birds, then when a random bird is crying out in the wild, a sound that you're otherwise going to completely ignore suddenly becomes, this thing full of meaning. And I was kind of sad that I don't yet have this appreciation of birds. And I was actually thinking that it might be something worth getting into. I don't know what you guys reckon.
Oh, well, I'm obviously biased as a birder myself, but I mean, I think it's absolutely, that reflects my experience that I've had, right? So I was aware of the fact that birdsong is a pleasant thing. It's nice to hear birdsong in the garden. But then to start to be able to pick apart that song and be like, that's the call of this bird, that's the call of this bird. It really is a door swinging open. And that's what I think, what I like most about this podcast is her attempts to describe birds, which are so different from us, and yet we can't help but anthropomorphize birds because that's a big part of our language in terms of trying to relate these creatures, and obviously it's something we do because we're fond of them as well. But when she talks about jackdaws sounding like they're petulant, like things aren't going their own way, and things like, there's these kind of like grasping for the right language to use to talk about birds. I just find it such an opportunity. I've basically hijacked this podcast because I wanted to talk about birds, but I really appreciate that all three of you have given this a punt and come away, not hating the experience. So
yeah, not hating the experience.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So Jack, what made you want to read The Peregrine initially? Because it seems like that was your gateway drug into all of this.
Yes.
And I can't imagine myself thinking or seeing a book about a guy following a falcon for 10 years and thinking, yeah, I want to read that,
Excellent question. So basically, I'm a writer about experimental music, so I do a music website as well. There's an album that I reviewed a few years ago called The Peregrine by a chap called Lawrence English, which is a album dedicated entirely to the book of the same name. And I'd known about this album since about 2012. And I knew that it was based on a book, never really thought to check it out until in the last year. This is why your podcast that I listened to today resonated so much on reading. In the last year, I decided to really stretch myself in terms of the types of books that I'm reading. And because I want to be a better writer, just explore how different people are writing about entirely different subjects. And this was a book that I thought, right, well, I need to give nature writing a shot. I remember that book, The Peregrine. Apparently it's like a seminal nature work, so I'll check it out. And yeah, fucking hell, it's unbelievably good. Like, I cannot even. It made me think about music writing differently, for sure, because again, it's about the translation of one medium into the medium of writing. So, although the medium is birds, not sounds. So yeah, that's been my route in, but it's been like quite a journey. It's been great.
All right, you fully sold me on this. I've just bought it on Kindle.
No, you haven't, really?
Yeah, $4.99 Kindle store.
Get in. Keep me posted.
It's got to be done.
Oh, this is so good.
Oh my god, and they've got the Audible version as well for an extra $2.99. Have you tried listening to the audiobook, or is it? Do you feel it's a book best to be absorbed in the written form?
I listened to it in like there was like a fishing platform by a pond which is right behind my place of work, so I could listen to birds and read a book about birds while also occasionally looking up at the birds. So
damn.
Wow.
Right, that's yeah.
That sounds like, yeah. I just can't even believe that.
Right, it's like level 10, but hey, like I said, if you're ready for it, dive in.
I'm going to try and retrieve our podcast from the world of birds right now, because I feel like episode party has become bird party, which is like not a bad thing in itself, but I haven't checked online. I'm pretty sure the domain for bird.party is not available. So
leave it to me.
I tried to do something a bit clever with the ordering of our podcast recommendations this evening, which was to kind of like do a tech sandwich where kind of technology was kind of in the middle, and then you've got kind of podcasts about nature on the outsides. So I hope that's what's going to play out. Otherwise, that's a really stupid thing for me to have just said. So with all that being said, Ali, your podcast is up. Tell us a little bit about it and why you like it.
Okay, so I suggested the IndieHackers podcast. And this is a podcast where they interview usually individuals or small teams of people who code and who are making businesses on the internet, making various sorts of products. And the cool thing about this is that it shows you the behind the scenes of the sorts of companies and businesses that people are making who have gone for this dream of working for myself, building a business that sustains my lifestyle while also providing value to the world, not being beholden to a boss, working their own hours, pretty much doing whatever they want. So I think everyone who's even vaguely into coding has this dream that, one day I want to have this sort of business that generates this quote passive income that lets me live off, which means I can do whatever I want, like watching birds and reading about birds and hearing the sound of birds. Which is quite hard to do when you're in the middle of a hospital or if you're in the middle of a corporate job, that sort of thing. So the podcast itself is very good in terms of having these interviews. And the episode that I suggested is by the founder of a company of a website called park.io. Now, this is going to take a little bit of explanation for people unfamiliar with domain name backordering. So if you don't mind, I'll just kind of explain a little bit about the context behind this.
Please do.
Absolutely.
So essentially, a domain name is, something that you see on the internet, like google.com is a domain name, facebook.com or myspace.co.uk, those domain names that are essentially where websites are stored, for want of a better word. And domain names are one of those weird things that people will pay a hell of a lot of money for. Like, for example, I think the world record was sex.com, which sold for like tens of millions of pounds, something stupid like that. Because you can imagine if you're building a business, you'd definitely want the .com domain, like apple.com. If Apple didn't have it, they would have wanted to buy for, hundreds of millions of pounds because it just means a whole lot in the world of the internet. Yeah. Now, normally in like the 90s, there was this whole craze of people buying up domain names to later sell. So now if you want to name a business, it's really hard to find the .com domain name for it. Like, it's almost impossible because there's all these companies and people that have bought up practically every .com that you can hear of and are now reselling them at huge margins, which doesn't really allow individual coders who have an idea to get their .com domain. So one way around this is that a lot of these domains that you might have your eye on, they always expire a year from the date that they were last renewed. And if they're not set on auto renewal, that domain will expire. And then there is, it's essentially a free-for-all where anyone can get their hands on that particular domain. Now, the guy behind this website, park.io, he's essentially built this automated system that flags up whenever there's a domain expiring that might be highly valuable. So, for example, just looking at the website now, this like small letter domain names like dataset.me or i9.vc or swipe.io. These are sorts of things that people would probably pay a lot of money for. And he's built this automated system behind the scenes that somehow uses all of his coding knowledge to try and grab as many of these domains as possible. And then he just runs an auction on this website that allows people to bid for it. And so if someone bids for it, like the most recent sale, swipe.io, which is a bit of a weird domain, sold for $70,000. Symphony.io sold for $3,000, CryptoFund.io $1,000, and so essentially this guy is making all of that money because his software is doing the work behind the scenes to allow people to get these high in demand domains. And I just found this like an incredibly fascinating story because it's such a niche, rogue topic to have an interest in. And this guy has taken his interest in this topic, has built a whole system around it, and now has built a website that at the time, like 2 years ago, was generating over $100,000 per month in profit. And just the story of that was incredibly inspiring and made me much more inclined to try and learn coding. And everyone I've recommended this episode to has been super inspired by it and thought, wow, if I could, monetize my niche interest like that, that would just be the dream. Yeah. So that was kind of why I really like this particular episode. I don't know if you guys followed any of that.
No, I'm totally with you on this one. I do understand it. The whole part of the reason that episode party as a podcast started was because I saw the .party TLD, the top level domain, the bit nice. After the dot of the domain. That was coming up as like one that was new because we went through that period where they brought out all these kind of wild and wacky domains, and I just thought, what could I have that's like .party, because .party is quite fun. And for some reason I thought of episode.party and I bought it, and it wasn't probably until a few weeks later that I actually realized I was going to do something with it. And there was a point in my life where I had more domains like that, where I'd kind of kept them for future projects, which I didn't have a clue what they were going to be yet, but I just thought, that's a cool domain. I'll keep that. And then after a while, your renewal comes through every year, and you go, how much am I spending on things that I'm not using?
Can we have an example of a funky one that you kind of had for a while and then didn't use?
Well, my one of my current co-workers and I were originally a long time ago going to start up a creative agency called Monday, like a little creative design studio called Monday, and we had
Monday.com.
We had Monday.studio when .studio came out, and that was a really cool one. And actually, when that came up for renewal, probably end of last year, and I can't remember how much it was. It was just like a bit too much for me to justify keeping it because we weren't using it, and we actually had a guy email me a few weeks before the renewal saying, how much is it for me to take this off you because I'd like it. And weirdly, I never got back to him, but then it expired and no one's ever bought it, so I have no idea what happened there. But this is a roundabout way of saying it was a very well explained concept there, and I totally get it. The podcast, I quite enjoyed it. It was a bit of a new world to me, to be honest, because I just don't think I've not had one of those kind of ideas yet that's going to make me a load of money. And I suppose if everyone had them that easily, then no one would make any money. But it was one of these things where, like, you know, I had to listen to a couple of other episodes today, and I find that kind of world and that kind of mindset really intriguing, because I just don't have... I haven't had that idea yet. I'm trying not to say I don't have the mind for that, because I think, like, I don't know if you need to have... I suppose you need to have an entrepreneurial mindset, but I think anyone can have a good idea. It's kind of how you act on it, and it's what you do with it or don't do with it, like me not selling Monday.studio to that guy. So I find it really intriguing. I found it like a really interesting listen into a world that I was kind of like aware about. I knew about people who'd started their kind of online businesses and were like wildly profitable, and they work for themselves and all the rest of it. I get that world, but I've never kind of peeked behind the curtain, as it were. Like, I've only ever seen it from the other side, and I've only ever really seen the success of it. And it was interesting, you know, hearing about this guy who started Park.io, talking about what things kind of could go wrong for him, and, you know, how it all started, and, you know, what it's meant for his life as a whole, and, you know, whether he's considered growth or not, or hiring people and all the rest of it. And that's really, really interesting to hear that from the prospect of one person. I think the nice thing about it is that there are a lot of different answers to those questions, and it's nice to hear lots of different opinions on them, because I don't think there's any one good answer when you're kind of working for yourself and making those businesses for yourself. I think it's definitely like something that I can't relate to in the sense of like starting a business like this, but I found it like inspiring in the way that I still feel like it's out of reach, but then I just haven't had my really good idea yet, and that's what I'm going to keep telling myself anyway. But I did enjoy it.
So one day maybe.
Yeah, one day.
Yeah. I just think it's fabulous that podcasts like this exist. Like, this is not something that has direct utility to me, but I think it's such a privilege to be able to spend an hour in the company of someone and soak up their advice from someone in a very specialist field at no expense whatsoever. I mean, instead of perhaps, I don't know, there would have been an equivalent in the past where it was only really possible if you met someone for coffee and chatted to them about it. Podcasts like this mean that, you know, if you've got a podcaster who's asking the right questions of someone and hitting the points that you want them to hit, then you can get a lot of the information that you would want to get from these people. And I think that for a podcast that's quite ruthless about its utility, and I mean that in the sense that it's not trying to make itself sexy to people like me who don't have a primary interest in domains or internet business. It's just like, this is one for people who want to get the max output and actually make use of it because they have this pre-existing interest in it. And I think that just makes it such a strong podcast. I think this Mike chap who runs Park.io is a thoroughly likable guy. Like, I enjoyed his company, to be honest. He's very sincere about what he isn't good at. And some of these things, when you get these people on who run their own internet businesses, can be very relentlessly self-promotional and chest-beaty, and only really talk about their failures if they've come out triumphant on top of them and they're now, you know, whooping ass still. And I just thought, you know what? I was really happy to just spend a bit of time with him and hear his kind of logic. I thought it was really interesting to hear about I mean, basically, he sounds like someone who's just relentlessly inquisitive. He's always asking, like, oh, shit, could this be better? I got beaten there. What can I do differently? And that, I think, does have a general application in the sense that, you know, it's really inspiring to hear from someone who's making it by having that constantly inquisitive mindset where he's just always trying to self-optimize on the basis of what failures have come into his path. And, you know, his remark about just going all in once you've got something that clicks, I think, again, that's a really interesting point. The one slightly unusual point I found in this podcast was there's a bit in the middle where the host kind of breaks off and does this like 2-minute bit where he sort of swerves into talking about his own experiences, but for quite a long time for an interview. And I was like, is Mike just sat here while this is going on? And I don't know who if he was, because I've got a feeling that some of the questions have been, and I don't know if this is true, and if he's listening, then apologies if this is wrong, but I think he's kind of overdubbed some of his questions or some of the bits as well. I don't think all of this interview was authentically done in real time. I think there's bits where he's gone in later and then inserted perhaps a bit more of an anecdote, because also he told it immaculately without umming or ahhing at all, which was super impressive. So that
ooh, interesting.
Yeah,
I've never clocked that for this episode. I should have a listen to it again.
Yeah, it struck me. Maybe he's just incredibly verbose and good behind the microphone, which that could be the answer. But yeah, it just caught my ear. But like I say, I'm just really glad that these kind of podcasts exist and that they can provide the opportunity just to get some super duper expert advice. Yeah, Tamor, what do you reckon?
Yeah, I've actually been a huge fan of IndieHackers in general since it started, maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, I think. I think what's really impressive is that this guy who started it, IndieHackers, not the guy who was on the interview, he's kind of built this amazing community that's sort of, like I was saying, sort of inspired loads of people to try and do this thing. And I think before IndieHackers came along, all the narratives in like tech and entrepreneurship were about like starting massive businesses that make billions of dollars, have thousands of employees. And then the sort of IndieHackers movement kind of made things much more accessible, because they kind of said that actually, a lot of people just want to start like a really nice, small niche business that affords them the lifestyle they want and maybe a bit more. And that's really admirable too. And so I think the community in general that it started is really, really impressive. And I think I'm not too clued up on other kind of industries, but I think tech in general has good communities that let people come together and help each other and inspire each other. And I think I think that's one of the really nice things about tech. And if I was in, say, like finance or something, I probably wouldn't be on like finance forums for fun in the evenings, whereas everyone in tech basically reads the same few forums and like hangs out with each other and stuff. So I think the community side is really good. I like what you said about this Mark guy just being really cool. Mike, I thought he was a really cool guy too. I think often, when you hear these interviews, it's a bit like trite. It's a bit, blowing their own trumpet and stuff. This guy was super cool. I thought that the domain things was interesting because I'd always assumed that it was like an efficient market. I assumed that like the domain buying and selling ship had sailed. I think he did this in like 2013 or 2012 or something. And by then, I think everyone already felt like all the good domains were taken. I sort of assumed that like someone would already be doing this. So it's not the kind of idea I would have thought about. So it's pretty cool that he managed to sort of build a business around this, even though that's what it seemed like.
Yeah.
And I personally sort of also buy random domain names when they sound cool. I think when they sort of released all those new TLDs, I think I bought a domain which was WYD, which is short for what are you doing, .fyi, and I didn't do anything with it for ages. And I ended up making like a Facebook Messenger bot that would sort of message you every 15 minutes asking what you're doing, and then you could sort of track your time that way by seeing like your answers to this thing.
Whoa!
But I didn't renew that when it came around.
Wow! Well, it would just message you.
Or like my friends who had signed up for like the beta test of it or something. But I never really.
Yeah, it was like the most annoying thing ever. You'd get a Facebook message every 7 minutes saying WYD, and you'd be like, "Oh my god!" It was cute. It was cute the first few times, and then it just becomes so frustrating.
Oh dear! It's nice to know you've got some honest testers there for the beta. Yeah. That's always a nice thing. Speaking of testing technology, That was about as smooth as a link between the two podcast recommendations.
Do you know what?
Going to be?
We'll know we're really smooth when we stop going, God, that was smooth, and then rupture our own flow when we do it.
I don't think we're ever going to stop congratulating ourselves when we manage to do that, Jack. I mean, you've got the power to edit it out, but I don't think you will somehow.
Not now. No.
The podcast I've got is Should This Exist, which is a podcast hosted by a woman called Katerina Fake, who was one of the co-founders of Flickr and is now a partner at Yes VC, a venture capital pre-seed and seed stage fund investing in the US and Europe. And it's a really, really interesting podcast. I actually found out about it because Katerina was on an episode of what's the podcast called with Alex Bloomberg, Jack? The one
Without Fail.
Without Fail, thank you very much. The one that I recommended about two episodes ago, so I should really remember. She was on there talking about her experiences of co-founding Flickr and everything she's done after that, and naturally there was some kind of plug for Should This Exist, which actually wasn't out at this point, and I signed up to a mailing list to find out when it was released, and when it was released I kind of listened in. I was really pleasantly surprised that it was just brilliant. I really, really enjoy it. So the idea of the podcast is they get creators or founders of different kind of technologies or emerging ideas to come on and kind of talk about the thing that they're building or pushing or creating, but in a kind of way that they're not necessarily kind of just extolling its virtues and talking about how great it is, but they're looking at it from a completely the opposite angle, which is to really question it and question kind of the human impact or the human side of it. And Katerina does a really, really good job of this. And I think it's that in itself is a really interesting angle for a kind of technology focused podcast. And I think it's also really interesting that the kind of people with their skin in the game, as it were, are coming on and having these discussions, and naturally they're towing a line and they're obviously going to advocate for the thing that they're making or pushing or building or selling. But I think fair play to them, they all seem pretty open to hear the criticisms and the critiques of the thing they're making and the kind of, well, what if it gets used in this way, or what if someone turns it round and turns it into this. I think they're very good at taking that on board and discussing that. I don't think that every kind of justification or answer they give is always satisfying. Sometimes I kind of feel like they're dodging it, which, you know, that they've got every right to do that as well, I suppose. But I do find it really interesting. The episode that I chose specifically was Boom, the return of supersonic flight. So this is about a blokey called Blake Scholl, who is the founder and CEO of an airplane startup called Boom, which is to do, you know, that does supersonic flight again. And I have like a weird obsession with Concorde and wish that I was not in like I don't go, you know, to the Concorde museums, but I just one of these things in life that I think I'll probably really wish, you know, if I never get to do it, I think it's one of the things I wish I'd have done in life is to have gone and done like supersonic flight, because I think the idea is fascinating. I think like Concorde was like deeply flawed as a thing. Like it was a tiny plane, it wasn't that comfortable, it cost a fortune to run, so I can see why they stopped it, but at the same time I really would have loved to have got to New York in like 2 hours or whatever the flight time was. It's ridiculous.
Sure. Yeah.
So this one had a kind of particular interest to me, and I think this episode's fairly typical of all of them. So I'm like I say, I really enjoy it. I think like the angle as a podcast is really interesting, and I think the conversations that come out of it are really interesting as well. Tamer, what do you think?
Yeah, this was the first. I'd actually heard about this podcast before, but I hadn't listened to any episodes. This was my first one. I'm actually super into planes right now. I'm about halfway through reading a biography of the Wright brothers.
Yes.
So like I've been sort of living in the world of the 1910s or whatever, where the Wright brothers are sort of setting up their first plane. And so like I'm really into this stuff right now. So this was a really cool episode for me. Nice. I really like that it's sort of the people behind these kinds of companies who are actually sort of in the firing line and like talking about the potential downsides or sort of knock-on effects on society and stuff. I thought that was cool. I think one of the potential criticisms that was raised during the episode was like, why are these guys trying to help super rich business people travel across the world faster when there are like far more pressing problems in the world? And I think that's like a criticism that's levied against tech companies quite a lot in general, and I'm not sure how I feel about it, because I just think it's quite harsh. Like if I think if you sort of extend that to sort of other things, it leads to weird places where
right, yeah.
For example, there's a big movement in some parts of the world called effective altruism nowadays, which is all about like giving money to charity most effectively. And that's really good. But again, one thing with that is that it's like, it's hard for me to articulate this, but it seems harsh to be sort of examining precisely how people are spending their time and money and saying, oh no, why are you giving to this charity and not this one, even though this one's more effective? Or like, why are you spending your time starting a company that does this rather than something, a company that does this other thing that like saves more people? And I'm fully on board the effective altruism bandwagon, but I think this is just a really difficult thing to solve almost. So I think like you could pretty much tell anyone who's spending their time doing anything that isn't, for example, buying malaria nets to save lives most effectively. You can pretty much tell anyone, like, why are you wasting your time doing that thing rather than saving lives? And so I just think it's kind of harsh, and I'm not sure that it's a fair criticism in practice. Because, for example, it seems like the founder of Boom, I mean, it seems like this is sort of his calling in life right now. He really wants to do this. I'm sure he'll be much better at doing this than he would be at doing lots of other things which he could be doing. And so I didn't really like that criticism too much, but I thought his sort of defense against some of these was really funny. I think whenever you have some kind of company that's selling some enterprise product, the kind of thing that doesn't really affect normal people, it's sort of they sell to businesses or really rich people, whatever. They always like to tie it back into family. So one of his sort of defenses was that if we help these business people fly long distances much faster, then they can spend more time with their families in the evenings. And this is like this is like a classic thing that like everyone comes back to when they sort of want to make a businessy kind of product seem also socially valuable. It's always like the family thing, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah,
but I thought it was a cool episode.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you picked up on that, because I think that argument of like, oh well, there's better things that people could be doing gets like really existential really quickly, doesn't it? Where all of a sudden you start thinking about anything you do in life and you go, well, why am I doing this when there's probably something more noble to be doing? And that's the end of that conversation, isn't it? And you're totally right. And if everyone in the world donated to buy malaria nets, we'd have probably too many malaria nets. I don't know. Everyone suddenly put all of the money that they ever gave to anywhere into that. We'd have a lot of malaria nets and probably not enough people to distribute them and all the rest of it. And I guess there's an argument to say that with all these things, and charity's a good example, but all these things are good examples, which is like someone at some point has got to like take a bet on this and see where it goes, and it could end up being really handy for something that's far more altruistic than just sending rich business people halfway around the world really quickly. I think it's interesting you picked up on that, because it does come up in more than one episode, I think, and it is it's quite an easy and recurring criticism to make of any new thing that is at all kind of fanciful and not necessarily 100% like you say, like buying malaria nets. Jack, what did you make of it?
I thought this was a really cool podcast. I think it's definitely a podcast that feels like the product of the overall changing relationship that we have with big technology companies, which feels perhaps less pertinent with Boom because they're doing transport, but there's a few founders that are speaking on this podcast in different episodes where their technology relates very much to subjects like identity and how we perceive and conduct ourselves and how we relate to each other, whereby I think now people are very skeptical of people who are purely technologists handling this stuff and not also having like a social conscience as well to deal with the inevitable upshot of their product being used by, say, like millions of people if everything goes well, because suddenly you're working with these kind of macro effects which you kind of need to be able to deal with early on, otherwise you'll get to the point where it's way too late and you're Facebook and you're like, oh, it's out of my hands, and there's a lot of effects that now are just taking place that are catastrophic and awful and blah. So I think it's definitely a podcast which is coming out at a time where we want to be able to scrutinize these people early on and say, so do you kind of know what you're dealing with here? Are you thinking about the effects of what you're pushing for here? And I think what is really fascinating is to hear these people dealing with these answers, and that often the answer that comes up most to these questions. So you should say, I think you probably mentioned, Freddie, but it starts with them sort of pitching it in sort of like a more traditional, founder's story kind of way, where they talk about the start of the business, and then the second half is called the workshop, where they bring in other people's voices to question it, and always the guy from Quartz, because it's co-produced by Quartz. So it's like, all these people are relevant to the topic, and it's like, oh, there's a guy from Quartz as well who's got a question. He's just going to chime in here, which I kind of like. But yeah, so in that workshopping bit, that's where they put all the questions to them. And it seems that a lot of the time, the answers that these founders give relate to this utopian idea. Like, all of them say, there will be a time where everyone can do this. Won't it be amazing when everyone's able to do this? And this sort of blanket idea that their technology will alter people's lives in the exact same way, regardless of, their social position, like what their life is like. There's a sort of... It always strikes me when I hear it. I've listened to a couple of episodes. It's like, they don't know how to answer these questions, so they just fall back to this very panoramic vision that they have. The one that I listened to other than this one was one on the product called Modulate. I don't know if you've heard that one, Freddie, but it's this voice altering software where you can make your voice basically sound like an entirely different person. And that was absolutely fascinating. I thought the questions that came up from trans people were absolutely fascinating. Obviously, that's a huge thing. And I thought those questions actually were so much more direct and pertinent than, say, the one that you referred to, Tamor, where it's like, you should be working on something else that's more important. Like, those questions felt a bit more precise and actually got into a bit more of a dialogue around, actually, this is the things that you really should be thinking about. So, yeah, I thought this was a cool podcast. I would definitely check out a few more episodes. I thought Katerina was a good host as well. So, yeah, I like it.
Great. Ali, we don't want to leave you out. What did you make of it?
Yeah, so I think you guys have said all the interesting things about the content-wise. I actually found myself thinking that I've not really listened to many podcasts at all where it's well produced. So this one and the one that Tamor recommended, where they've clearly put a lot of work behind the scenes with lots of audio, lots of interviews chopped up from different bits. And I was thinking, like, we're all podcasters now, and we know just how hard it is to even imagine doing that sort of production value, let alone doing it with any kind of consistency. So I found myself admiring kind of the segues into the background music and how they were bringing people in to talk about it. But one thing I found myself thinking is that actually I would have really liked it if it was just a 2-hour long form interview with the guy, the CEO of Boom. I think that might have made for a more interesting conversation where maybe he's got a bit more time to go into the nuances, perhaps even discuss this thing about this effective altruism and how that ties into stuff. I felt like he got away very easily by giving 30-second sound bites in response to these big existential questions. So I would have liked to see a bit more of that, but I suppose the way the format is for this podcast, they're doing it very bite-sized, something you can digest on your commute. So I appreciated the brevity in that sense.
Yeah. There was that question where he's like, they asking about, again, it's quite a big question, but they say, what about the possibility that you could be accelerating gentrification? And he goes, yeah, that's interesting. And then they cut off. And I'm like, if I asked that question, I'd be fucked. Like, come on.
Oh, dear. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. It would be really cool, actually, if it was kind of like every episode was 2 episodes in the feed, which is one which is like the kind of 30-minute roundup of the whole issue. And then there's like the 2-hour unedited full version where, it's probably going to get a bit squeamish, where this poor guy's going to have to try and squeeze himself out some real pointers. But there's something about, like, I mean, I don't know how much I could listen to that out of, like, sheer love of awkwardness. I don't think I could. But I do think that, yeah, you definitely get a lot more kind of colour and a lot more detail to some of the answers. And it'd be interesting to, like, it's almost nice sometimes. And it's one of the things that I like about your guys' podcast, which is that you hear the thinking and the development of the thinking as it happens, which is a really a really nice thing to listen to, which we will of course get to in due course. Before we do that, we have one more recommendation, and that's from you, Tamor. Tell us a little bit about your recommendation.
Cool. So I recommended an episode of a podcast called Radiolab. Radiolab's been going on for ages. It's like produced by WNYC Studios, which are this massive, I think, public company that do loads of radio shows and stuff in the US. And so like there's a bunch of people working on this full time, and it really shows like the production value is through the roof. I mean, they spend like months and months with teams of multiple people researching each episode and then producing it and stuff. And so, yeah, each episode they sort of investigate. It's sort of like investigative journalism, but just in sort of voice form. So they kind of investigate some topic, and they have interviews with sort of relevant people, and they have sort of their own thoughts and their own thinking, and they sort of weave it all in together. And the episode I recommended was one called The Rhino Hunter. And I actually listened to this when I was in my third year of university. This was like my first foray into podcasts. And so this episode was about the topic of trophy hunting, which is something that we hear about, maybe once every year or once every 2 years when it's in the news. You guys might remember the case of Cecil the lion a few years ago, where some like American dentists paid something like $50,000 to go and hunt this endangered lion. And then this sort of dentist got a bunch of death threats, and he lost his job and all this kind of stuff. And so every now and then it's something that comes up in the news, and everyone gets very emotional about it. And in the past, I'm a huge animal fan. I used to want to be a vet for most of my life. In the past, I thought that I thought this was one of the issues that's so clear cut that there can't be any nuance to be had here. And I thought I had a strongly held opinion that trophy hunting was atrocious and unforgivable. And I very strongly believed this. But after listening to this episode, I kind of realized that it was an issue which gets a bit of media attention every now and then, and lots of people have strong opinions about it, whereas very few people are actually that informed about it, and I certainly wasn't. And so the really cool thing about this was that it kind of, it sort of informed me about what's actually going on in trophy hunting, right? So the narrative when you hear the news stories is that, some rich white dude from America has paid tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to go and kill an endangered animal. And that's all they tell you. And on the face of it, that sounds awful. If you dig a bit deeper, though, and you ask, who the hell is he paying to hunt this animal? Is he paying the animal? Obviously not. Just digging very slightly into it, you kind of see that actually trophy hunting programs are managed by conservation agencies, and they're responsible for something like 70 or 80% of the income of conservation agencies. So by, a few years ago, there was a guy called Corey Knowlton. He paid, I think, upwards of $100K to go and hunt a endangered black rhinoceros in Namibia. And the $100K that he paid went to the sort of Namibian Wildlife Trust or whatever, in order to help conserve the lives of other rhinoceroses. And there's tons of other nuances as well. The animals that trophy hunters kill are typically really old, unproductive members of the species. So this black rhinoceros, for example, which is the case that's discussed in the Radiolab episode, this animal was super old, infertile, really aggressive. It was a nuisance to local communities. It was killing other rhinos. And so it's really not very clear cut at all that what's going on is bad. And so, I thought this was an amazing episode because it kind of opened my eyes to the fact that I'm not really qualified to have opinions on most things. But before this, I would have happily said, trophy hunting's really bad. And then the other cool thing was it was also very personal. The whole thing was just long interviews and segments where the Radiolab producers actually went to Namibia with this guy when he was on his hunting trip, and they were getting his thoughts after he shot the rhino and so on. And so it really opened my eyes to sort of the human side of it, because I don't really know any people in my life who are into this kind of stuff, so I didn't really have any empathy with them. Whereas kind of spending an hour and a half intimately sort of hearing from this guy kind of gave me a lot more empathy for hunting, which is this thing that's completely alien to me.
Yeah.
Well, that's mine and Freddie's opinions. Freddie, what do you reckon?
That's mine as well, for the record.
The irony is that we probably have a lot of opinions on Radiolab, and mostly good ones, I'd imagine, because Radiolab's one of the rare episode party recommendations that we've given a free pass on to be repeated. We try and not do it, but with Radiolab we can't help it, because it's surprisingly not many people have recommended it, but every time it has been recommended, it's always warranted talking about, because I think it's got such a wonderful appeal. And I think actually, Tamer, you just went through about 5 or 6 different reasons there why it's a good podcast, and I think everyone gets something different out of it, and so it's always worth discussing. you were absolutely right. For the most part, the thing that always strikes me about Radiolab is how brilliantly produced it is, and this kind of format that's out now, is mostly popularized by like NPR podcasts, National Public Radio in America, of kind of like very slickly produced, narrated, very narrative format, with a journalist who's narrating it, and then it's lots of other voices coming in and lots of different sounds, whether that's kind of field recordings or music or whatever else. It's been done time and time again now, and some examples are great and some examples are clearly trying to do something and not really doing a great job of it. But I think Radiolab probably really started it all, perhaps This American Life as well, but Radiolab's one of those podcasts that just does this brilliantly well-produced podcast format extremely well. And they do it extremely well in the sense as well that there are kind of like almost 3 hosts. So you've got Jad Abumrad and Robert Krulwich, who are kind of like the kind of in-studio co-hosts of Radiolab as a whole. And then you've got other people coming into that. So in this sense, there's Simon Adler, who's the producer, who is following this guy Corey around when he goes on his hunting trip in Namibia. And, you have the other people kind of coming in with their voices and talking about stuff. And they edit it in such a way that, Jad and Robert, who are not actually involved in the reporting of the story, but they come in and do their recording of their script afterwards, they'll ask a question. And then Corey, who's the subject that's been recorded out in Namibia, is answering the question. And they've just done such a good job of like cataloging all of this audio, transcribing it all. Someone's then sat down and gone through and edited this story together. Then they've produced these scripts for Jad and Robert, and they've gone in back into a studio, they've recorded them, and someone's edited it all together, and it's done in such a way that it literally feels like a conversation between 4 people. And it's, we were talking earlier, about how these things just take a lot of time, and as podcasters we know that it's massively involved, and it's just so good. So I thought I'd stick to like one thing there about that I really, really love about it, because I know everyone else is going to have really interesting things to say about this podcast as well. Ali, what did you make of it?
So I think, again, like just to echo everything that you guys have said about just the sheer production value of Radiolabs, I've never actually listened to a Radiolabs episode other than this one, so I need to probably start doing that now, because it just feels like it felt like such a well-produced piece of work that I like. The mind boggles that things like this exist in the world and are fully available for free. It's just absolutely mental. The thing that I really liked about it, so we listened to this when we were in Iceland. It was me, Tamor, and our mum, and I don't know if you guys have been to Iceland, but it involves a hell of a lot of driving through these random roads, like 7 hours of driving to get to any reasonable location. But in fairness, like along the way, it's quite pretty. And I think when Tamor put this podcast episode on, it really brought the family together in like a nice way, because our mom was like super engrossed in it as well, and she never gets engrossed in anything like this. Like, if I tried listening to an episode of the Tim Ferriss Show, she'd be like, "What the hell's going on?" But this was just so interesting, and it brought everyone together. And I think at the time we had a lot of interesting chats about the morality of things like this, and kind of just to echo what Tamor says, we all hold these very strong opinions about things that we really have no reason to be able to reasonably comment on. And I think what this episode taught me overall is that whenever there's any kind of issue where it seems obvious what the right answer is, like this happened in the latest general election, being a university student at the time, clearly everyone is anti-conservative and pro-Labour, and so the sentiment around the whole university was, oh my god, how can people be so selfish as to vote Conservative? And then I was kind of thinking that, hang on, that was like 38% of the electorate, like they can't all just be selfish pricks. And equally for stuff like Brexit, where it seems so clear-cut in the circles that we hang around in that clearly Brexit is bad. I find it interesting just seeing the other side of the coin, and I think this episode has just given me more of an appreciation of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Jack?
Yeah. This episode has really stuck with me. Like, this is maybe the one episode of Radiolab that I think, if you ask me to name a Radiolab episode 10 years from now, I'd name this one. That is stuck in my head. I think I listened to it when it first came out, and then so when you recommended it, I was like, I know exactly what that episode is. I remember being on a train listening to it.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. And I was so engrossed. And all I remember really from that initial listen is coming out and feeling utterly fraught about my opinions on the subject. Whereas, I mean, as you've already said, going into it, I was like, well, this is clear cut. And they bait you as well, because they set up this auction where they're auctioning off these, rights to go and get these permits, and you're like, boo, oh, you guys suck. And then gradually they're like, oh no, and then they turn it round, and the way they do it is almost like a perfectly pitched sort of true crime thing, where you are tossing back and forth, and you're not allowed to settle in your state of mind. Like as soon as you feel like, okay, I kind of feel like I land on this side now, they bring in another voice who just sort of dislodges you from your position a bit, and you come out the other side just kind of like, oh, I don't know what to think. So I think for that reason, this podcast is utterly brilliant. This episode is really great, and it reminds me of this has come up on a couple of podcasts I've listened to, but there's various versions of it, but the trolley problem, where you can save people on a train track if you push someone onto the train track, or to like block the train from coming, it won't hit these people that are further down the track, or you can hit a button which then pushes a lever which pushes someone onto the track. People are more keen to push the button than they are to actually push the person, even though the net effect is the same. It's the proximity to the nasty thing, even though the net effect is greater. And I think that's what's coming into effect here. It's like you're too close to the horrible kind of hunting aspect, where someone is definitely getting a kick of killing an animal, and yet even if the net effect is greater, it still feels utterly wrong, because you're drawn into that very cinematic death of a single creature. And I think obviously they produce it in a way where you get drawn into that story as well, because you go on the hunt with them, so that gets thoroughly amplified, the actual act of killing the creature. And yeah, so I just really it tore me up, like in terms of what I think of the subject, which is exactly what they intended to do. I have to say that I don't listen to Radiolab anymore, just because I do find the production style very annoying. I think it goes too fast. I find myself feeling a little bit patronised by it. Like it's almost like if there was a moment of silence, they worried that I'd just throw my headphones off. And there's also, they do this thing which appears in every episode. We probably talked about it last time, but where generally Robert Krulwich will go, wait, what, and then ask someone to explain, as if he's just he's had a nap and then woken up and sort of missed the last 20 minutes. But which is, I get it, because I think it's a device to kind of avoid them doing like a very straight narration of the story. It kind of keeps it dynamic because everything's taking place through a conversation. But I just find it all a bit dizzying, really, with that plus all the field recording plus the voices in the studio going over to here, there and everywhere. I feel like that the story is compelling enough, like so compelling, without them having to frame it like a 40-minute movie trailer. And the best bit for me is there's a bit with Corey where they talk to him, and he's asked to basically justify his position, and they just play this like 1-minute tape of him giving his answer without anything else. That to me was my favourite bit, because you just hear Corey's brain whirring, you get a lot of silences, you can hear that he's kind of riled up, that he's been asked these questions and that people aren't understanding his point of view. So yeah, I mean, this episode is, I should underscore the fact this episode is brilliant, but Radiolab as a whole, I admire it utterly for the amount of work that goes into it, but stylistically it's just not one that clicks with me per se.
Yeah, I would also recommend that if you are listening to this, Jack, you mentioned it goes fast there. If you're listening to Radiolab using the Overcast podcast, turn off the remove silences thing, because it goes even faster when you remove all of the pauses and the gaps out of it. It goes extremely fast. And definitely don't listen onto it on like 2 times speed or anything like that, because it's really hard to keep up with. Yeah. That would be my recommendation. Yeah, so I think we are pretty much there with recommendations, but it would be a crying shame if we didn't talk, at least briefly, about Not Overthinking, which is a podcast that I know I'm a massive fan of. I've been listening since the beginning, and Jack, I know you've been. Oh my God, you've been listening. Yeah. I think actually it was our podcast host Transistor FM tweeted about you, and
they did, yeah.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah. And I've been listening since. And I touched upon it earlier, but I love the kind of dialogue that plays out between you both, and when you have guests on as well, where you're kind of thinking through these ideas and debating them and talking about them. And I like that. And it's something that Jack, you almost kind of touched upon it then with Radiolab. It's nice to hear like people's brains ticking away and chewing over ideas, and I think you both do a really, really great job of that. How do you go about choosing topics to talk about? Where does that come from?
Yeah.
Oh God, that's the challenge every week. It's like, oh crap, what are we going to talk about this week? And I think at the start we both had this idea that, how hard can it be? There's so many topics within the field of social interaction and stuff that we can probably just overthink about. But I think these days, at least what I tend to do is I think, is there anything that Taimur or I have come across this week that's particularly pertinent that we could talk about? So this week, the episode we did was about rejection, which was particularly pertinent in the week. One of the episodes was about why we're recording it at 2:00 in the morning, which we had to do that day. So that worked out nicely. So far we've been keeping just one step ahead of the weekly schedule, but it's been a challenge.
Yeah, I think ideally we'd sort of get these ideas for interesting discussions throughout the week and sort of note them down. I use an app called Notion. I think I'll use that now as well. So every time I do have something that I keep thinking about, maybe a few times in a week, or I have something I'd like to sort of think more about with other people, I kind of note that down, and that sort of makes this pipeline of ideas. But even then, sometimes there are weeks where it's like, oh man, we don't really have a good idea. What the hell should we talk about now?
Yeah, I mean, I should say as well, big fan, think it's a fabulous podcast. I think what I absolutely love is that there's a lot of podcasts that I think are touching on these topics, but I mean, it follows on from what Freddie's already said, but they talk about it in a means of like having the answers and giving you all the information you need to implement improvements in whatever area. So rejection, for example, it's like they've got the answers for how to deal with rejection. Don't worry, just sit back and listen, soak it up, and you'll be fine.
Yeah.
Whereas, you sound like you're coming at it from the position of the listener, which is amazing. And then so you're drawn on this journey together to like get to the point where actually you all have hosts and listeners have a better idea of how to navigate that subject. I mean, I'm intrigued as to what is it that you get out of having these conversations. The podcast is called Not Overthinking, but the deliberation between you is, I mean, obviously as a listener, it's where the value comes in. But I mean, what does talking these things through do to you or for you?
Yeah, I'm really glad you guys mentioned the whole thing about being actively thinking while we're talking and doing the podcast, because that's really what I wanted to go for here. Because I think there's lots of podcast formats where it's like one person interviewing someone else who's like the expert on some topic,
yes,
and it's them like telling you a bunch of things you should do, or like which is great in its own right. But in some episodes, I talk about why I don't like the self-help industry, and I think part of why that is because I think there's a lot of value in sort of thinking, being part of the thinking through things, because I think in the process of like thinking through things, it sparks off other ideas and thoughts, which are really, really valuable. And so if it was just, if we were like experts on these topics and we were just like dishing out these sort of nice, well-phrased things about what you should do and what you shouldn't do, I think that would be actually less valuable for these topics. Because I think these are the kind of topics that it's just the kind of thing that everyone sort of would benefit from thinking about. And that's kind of just what we're doing. We're just like thinking about these things and chatting about it. But yeah, to your question, yeah, these genuinely are things that I want to explore. So I also sort of have a little blog and I like to tweet and stuff. And so I think I have a bit of like an idea pipeline where if there's something I've been thinking about, I'll sort of tweet about it. And then if I keep sort of thinking back to it, maybe I'll write a blog post about it. Or maybe we'll do a podcast about it. And that sort of just lets me explore the idea in a bit more depth and sort of properly think it through with another person, which is really good. And it's just nice to sit down once a week with Ollie and chat, really. Don't know what Ollie thinks.
Thanks, man. Yeah, I think I definitely feel the same way. I think for me, the main value is just in in having that chat, because I think one of the great things about the podcast format is that it encourages you to explore ideas in a way that a standard conversation just wouldn't. Because in a standard conversation between, for example, me and Tamor, there's so much assumed knowledge that goes into it and assumed background that I might say a phrase that he would fully understand what I'm talking about, but I might not really understand the intricacies of it. And so if we're in a podcast format and we're having to articulate these thoughts in a way that other people can understand them, I think it makes our own thinking on these matters a lot clearer. And for me, similarly to Tame, I've got a sort of an idea pipeline because I make YouTube videos on the side. And so a lot of topics like, motivation, consistency, productivity, these come up a lot amongst the sort of topics that my viewers care about. Viewers sounds weird. And so just sitting down for half an hour to an hour and actually hashing them through and bringing up all of the various counter arguments that we can think of, I find it to be quite helpful in developing my own thinking, and hopefully then I can form some kind of thesis on the subject that I can then deliver as a nicely packaged piece of advice to people on the YouTube channel. So yeah, I find it quite valuable in that sense as well.
Great. I think it's wonderful. Freddie and I will no doubt keep listening. It's a really nice podcast, I think, for just keeping you reflexive and inquisitive as a listener. So thank you very much. I mean, if people want to check out the podcast for themselves, where's the best place for them to be doing that?
Probably on the website. So we're on notoverthinking.com, but you can find it on every podcast host. Tamor, sorry, were you going to say something different to that? Have we got a new URL?
I was going to say exactly that.
Oh, amazing.
Spot on.
And we're both hosted with Transistor, it seems. I was checking out your website. It looks very pretty.
That's Freddie's go. Yeah. That's all Freddie.
Yeah. Who did your logo, by the way? Your logo is really, really nice.
Oh, that was me, which is ridiculous because I have no design experience whatsoever, which is, yeah.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, no, thank you very much. That's very kind of you.
Yeah, where are we online, Freddie, so people can see that lovely, lovely logo?
If you want to stare at that logo a little bit more, you can go to episode.party on the internet.
There's that domain name that you talked about.
There's that domain name. There it is. We're also episode_party on Twitter. Or if you have a recommendation for a podcast you want to share with us over email, you can email us at hello@episode.party. I think that just about covers us. Ali and Tamor, thank you so much again for coming on and being wonderful guests and bringing some great recommendations. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for having us. It's been really fun.
And for talking about birds as well. It's been great.
Got to get the birds at the end. Brilliant. Everyone's going to remember birds from this podcast.
Exactly.
Then I've
Fantastic.
succeeded. Great.
Brilliant. I'm going to start reading that book. It's going to be sick.
Yes. Keep me posted.
Well, I don't want to keep anyone from reading any longer. So if you're listening at home, go watch some birds. Go read the book about birds. Go look at some birds in the garden. Go listen to some birds. And don't even bother with our podcast when it comes out next time. But we will see you next time. All right. Goodbye.
Bye.
Hey everyone, Freddie here. If you like the show and like listening to us recommending podcasts, then do us a favour and recommend this podcast to a friend of yours. If you know someone who's in the market for a new podcast or is just getting started in the world of podcasts and wants to find some new shows to listen to, why not recommend Episode Party? They can tune in, they can download a few episodes, and they can find out about all sorts of different podcasts, and we'll get a new listener while we're at it. So that would be really helpful, and we'd really appreciate it. Thanks for listening.